Right, ladies and gentlemen, volunteers, and there's lots of you here, which always makes me a little bit nervous because you're checking my own work, so I have to be a bit careful on that. So my name's Mac, it's Mac McDonald, sounds like a godfall, that is my real name. I worked for the Commission for a couple of years now after a career in the Air Force. It's a fascinating organisation. It's so multifaceted you wouldn't believe, and every rule that there is in the world, and there's lots of them, have been broken several times. So please be kind when you're challenging me about certain things. Now, generally when we give talks, we give them a location where it might be in a churchyard or one of our cemeteries where we can talk about the casualties. On this occasion, we were kindly invited down by Dennis, and I've lost you wherever you are, down there, to come along to work in cooperation really with the At-Risk War Memorials Register, because of course all the names that are on there are very likely repeated by us in cemeteries either in this country or perhaps overseas or on memorials. So there is a lot of crossover on that. And of course the most important thing behind all of this is the personal stories and the sacrifice that those people went through. So we're on a common goal. So I was asked very politely if I would talk about the recovery or the archaeology, if you like, of reclaiming our war dead that we haven't actually got and found, identified. Now this is a difficult one for me, not because I'm not an expert on it, and I'm not, but because generally it's not a talk that we give. We've got four main ones, but it's not one that we've adapted to yet, but I'll see how it goes today and see if we can change that. Now, I'm really lucky today because with me I've got several people from the Commission who know probably a lot more than I do about it, so if I get stuck I'll just point to them. So just so that you know, Claire Jones to my right is the Eyes On, Hands On coordinator for the region. She looks after many of you lovely volunteers, and she's well travelled in the area. I'm trying to say things nicely without it sounding bad. Well travelled. Okay, I don't think that's too bad. I've got Chris Hawes, who's hiding somewhere at the back. He's our regional manager, so if you've got a question about headstones, not only here but overseas where he's also worked, Ben, I'm going to point you towards him. And Sarah Moody is somewhere over there, who's my opposite number and works into the centre, what we call now Centre East? Or Central England. The boundaries were moved slightly. So but we our areas butt up alongside each other, which is why she's coming on today. And anybody else I've missed? Oh, Juliet. So Juliet's really important because I've already had a couple of questions about it.
I've answered some.
She is partly responsible for the signs that you would see on cemeteries and churchyards.
Come and speak to me afterwards if you have them.
Yeah, if there's any queries, go and speak to her and she will tell you exactly why you haven't got one or why you should have one, and we might be able to help. So,
and you forgot one other person, but then you might not see him very often. There's a man lurking behind. So
Mark.
Mark looks after me.
I support Claire in all of her good works in head office.
I like the way you support her. That's
She does all the great work.
yeah. Sorry, Mark.
I'm IT.
Well, IT, I've got loads of questions for you after. Yes. So you were probably the most important person here today and I missed you. So, what we're going to talk about today, well, it's a Commonwealth War Graves Commission. Now, I'm talking to a lot of the converted, so a lot of you know this already. But prior to the formation of the Imperial War Graves Commission, anybody who died in battle would probably get a pretty poor deal out of it, unless you were a very senior officer, in which case you might be buried with a horse statue somewhere in London. Everybody else probably wouldn't get that. This really came to the realisation during the Boer War when we got a lot of journalists who've gone out to that campaign, and they're now reporting back to London and the other centres, explaining exactly what's happening to their loved ones. So what's happening to the men out there. So those poor souls from the Army and Navy were getting poor treatment. If they were buried at all, it might not be recorded, and you know, they probably wouldn't get any kind of edifice apart from a wooden cross, which of course would fall apart. Now fast forward then into the First World War, And of course, this was a war that was going to be over by Christmas, wasn't it? However, very quickly after it started, one key person who's involved in the Red Cross in the mobile unit was had identified early on that this is getting very complicated, and his job, Fabian Ware, was to get the casualties back from the front with the Red Cross and into the regimental aid posts and the casualty clearing stations. But he recognised there were a lot of little cemeteries and people being buried ad hoc. So he started recording that. And he was recording this during the war. This is what we've got to remember. And that work that he did continued all the way to the end of the war. Very complicated and very difficult work. He managed to get enough people on board to increase the size of the unit, and it became, rather than just a Red Cross mobile unit, it was a grave registration unit, and then it got bigger and bigger until it became something that was actually dedicated to finding those casualties and trying to find their identity. Now, the biggest task of all came at the end of the First World War, because once the end had come, we've now got all these casualties everywhere, most of whom we've tried to record as best we possibly can. But now we've got to return the country back so that the French and the Belgians can carry on farming, they can use their land, they need to clear it to get back to proper life. Now, luckily, those governments decided that they would gift pieces of land for us to have cemeteries on. Now, what that means is we have got to move people from existing cemeteries and put them into these new consolidated cemeteries, the much larger ones that we would recognise today. So how do you do it? Well, you've got to get people to go out there and exhume, dig up the remains of people where we think they are. Now, there are many problems with this. You'll have to excuse me, I am passing out handouts because I would normally work to PowerPoint. So I've got a few of each, so if I send some one way and some the other, that hopefully will work. So we've got some pictures there, if you'd just like to pass those round. And what they show you is those military personnel who are tasked with the grisly job of exhuming people. Now, if we were to exhume somebody out of a churchyard, somebody who's been buried there, then the tent would go up, there'd be certain rules that we've got to comply to, we'd make sure we get the person out, as much of the remains as possible, we'll move them, and it would be all done by paperwork. If you then take it to a battlefield site, where the cemetery where the person was recorded, and we know they are, but then the front line has moved across, or shells have come into that area, it's now going to be very, very difficult to make sure that you've got the right people that you've got located on your bits of paper. Now, what I'd like you to look at is on those pictures, you'll notice that the soldiers who are doing this job have got all the correct PPE on to make sure that they haven't got any chance of any form of disease whatsoever. Now, there are some rather awful stories about what they were finding. So now, of course, we're into bones. Back then, we're a few years after, or maybe 8 months, then you've got corpses that have turned to a kind of buttery liquid. So they're trying to pick these up, some of it done with shovels. Some corpses are complete and they can move those. But one of the ways of identifying people, we just started to establish properly the identity discs. And I've got another one of those. I've only got a couple of these, I'm afraid. So I'm sure you'll all be aware of what an identity disc is. But what they did do in the First World War, and I'll pass these round, is they made it so that there was 2 of them. And the reason that you want to, if you can pass that one and pass this one, is the second identity disc would be the one that you would cut off. And they decided that it would be a different shape, it would be hexagonal, so that if you were looking for it in the dark, or you're going through a cadaver that you can't really find anything, you do it by feel, you can cut that one away and leave the other with the corpse, so that later on we know we've got the right one.
Does that persist to this day?
So What a great question. I knew you'd come for a reason. So I joined the military in 1983, and we had pretty similar dog tags. These are my ones from back in the day, and we used to stamp them up ourselves. Now, they would tell you that one's resistant to chemical and another one's resistant to oils. I think they're made out of compressed cardboard. I don't think they're resistant to very much at all, if I'm honest. But you can pass those around. I'd like them back because they were mine. But you will see that that same technique that was used in the First World War continued right up until the mid-80s. And then later on, I can fast forward to Afghanistan, and we've now got metal ones. And the same kind of technique where you take the bottom one off, we've got a cross on there because it was quite a thing in Afghanistan what religion you were, because the people we were working with were very religious. So if you were atheist, they weren't too happy with that. But there's another example, so you can pass those around. I'd also like them back. So yes, it does persist to this day. Now, there were different versions of them. The Germans had a coin almost that you could break in half. They had all kinds of different versions of them, but actually the one that you've seen now that's going around pretty much survived to this day. Is it a perfect system? Of course it's not, because if the body's been blown up afterwards, we might not find any of them bits, any of those ID discs. So, one of the other things that would help us, hopefully, and I've only got 2 of these I'm afraid, is we would look at where the area is, and they would draw grids over it, and they would say, right, well, in grid so-and-so there are this many casualties, and this is the casualties that I think are there. Now you can have a look. What we do know afterwards is that actually when they got to those grids, they found that either there was far more casualties than anybody recognised, or the ones that they thought were there had shifted. They'd been moved by military explosions, or they'd just got it slightly wrong, or the front line had moved, or they'd actually dug people up and moved them while they were doing their own excavations to build more trenches. So you can see how terribly complicated and layered this process was for them. So, what happens now? At the end of the war, there comes a point where they say, do you know what? We think we've got as much as we can possibly feasibly get. We've got as many of the casualties as we can. If we don't find somebody, we can't find John Smith, we know he died, then he will end up on a memorial. And that's why we've got the big memorials at the Menin Gate, Antiqueval and the likes, where those names are recognised. If in later years it transpires that we find that individual by farm work or building work or excavations of some kind, then once we've positively 100% identified him, then he will be buried with full military honours, a headstone with all his details, and eventually his name will come off of the memorial where he was, so we'll record him once. Now, of course, the longer the years go on, the more difficult that becomes. So recently, at the beginning of this year, I went out to the our centre in France, where we've got, and I'll call it a recovery unit. It's basically, it looks like a morgue, but at the back of the morgue, we've got lots and lots of bodies in there. But of course, they're just bones. But with them, they've captured anything that was there alongside them. So any artifacts, it might be buttons, it might be cigarette cases, all that kind of thing, because it might help identify them. So I will pass around a couple of pieces of evidence with a skeleton, and it just gives you a flavour of the kind, there's a few in there, of the kind of things that might help us identify those casualties. Now, somebody mentioned earlier about DNA. Well, of course we can do DNA now, and the techniques are getting better and better all the time, but you've got to have somewhere to start. So it's no good DNA in something if you haven't got the relative's DNA. So it's not as simple as you would think. Thank you very much, sir. I've got one back, I'm only waiting for the other one. So those items that we might find on them would be really important. So we need to know, what kind of things do you think we need to know about? If we found a casualty, what do we need to know to identify him? What will help?
His regiment.
His regiment, great. And what will help us identify that regiment? Cap badges. Shoulder flashes. Buttons, so regimental buttons, of course, back in the day they would all have the buttons. Now, there is a problem with that, and you will see that on those diagrams it tells you where those items were located when they did the archaeology. And that's really important, because if you find his regimental cap badge in a pocket, is it his? Or has he swapped it? So if it's on his head, perhaps. Thank you very much. I've got them both back. You've all done very well. One of the most extraordinary cases, I think, was, and I can't remember where it was. There was one casualty found, and he'd got a different regimental button on every piece because he'd swapped it with somebody while he was in the trenches, and so he'd obviously done that to make our lives more interesting later on when we try and identify him. But that's a good example of why it's important where you find the artifact. So those shoulder flashes, if they're in the right place, that's one. You can certainly keep them. So each of those bits identifies. We can have a look at the different type of boots. Not every nation in our Commonwealth had the same footwear. We could even look at things like the rounds. I mean the bullets that have got the different types of cordite we used. So some that you'll see as long pieces of string like a wire, other were powder. I think I've got a picture of that somewhere.
In the treasure trove.
Maybe not. No. Oh yeah, I think it is actually. There's a small one in there. So obviously, if the rounds are in the right place where the ammunition would have been, that would be a help to us. We've then got to say, well, where were they? What was happening at that time? And for that, we would look at the battle maps. And the battle maps, and in this one, I'll pass this round, but there's a couple of red flags up in the corner there with the two casualties we're going to talk about. What overlaid over that is where the units were travelling at the time, and they were Canadian units. So, what we're trying to do is establish what regiment they are. We pretty much know who's missing by this stage, so we've got a list of those, and we're trying to match up, if we can, anybody who's left. And if we can identify them 100%, then we can tick that off our list and say we found one. But you'll see on the regimental maps as well, as they go into battle, it isn't as obvious and as plain as that. Because what often happens is, we would attack with the 1st Battalion in this line, 2nd Battalion next to us. The 1st Battalion fails in its objective, and the 5th Battalion comes along to support and take over. But the 5th Battalion, a reserve unit, has got all kinds of people attached to it because it wasn't at full strength. So then we end up with somebody from the Sherwood Foresters when it was a Leicester's attack, for instance. And that's why it's really important to identify those key bits of information that we can get out of them. I did have one. So I should have passed this one round earlier. When we talked about our battlefield casualties, one of the things that we always think of, the poor chap got shot. Don't forget, they could have been gassed. They could have drowned in some of the areas of the Somme in particular. But that was picked up in France at the beginning of this year, and that's just a piece of shrapnel off the battlefield. So if we pass that round, that small piece of metal that you can see there, you'll feel the weight of it and think that if you throw that hard enough, the kind of damage it will do. And of course there would be an awful lot more of that. Which is why often when we look at our skeletons, and I've got some under here, that one.
Yeah, there you go.
So here's, I've only got a couple of these, but the example here of the anthropology is, it tells you what bones are there and what aren't, because there might be an awful lot of them missing. So now, I'll pass these, we've got to now layer on the top of this, were they old? Were they young? Did they have any previous injuries on the bones that we could find? Because that might help us identify the difference between a 29-year-old granddad, as he would have been, or a 17-year-old young man who was fighting in the same regiment, and that would help us. So you can see with all these different layers how terribly complicated the identity of people really is. Now, obviously we're still doing this to this day, and in fact over the next few years we know that there's going to be an awful lot more casualties discovered, because there's big building programs going on in France with canals, hospitals that are going directly through former battle sites. Now in anticipation of that, we're of course ready with the archaeology, ready to do that and capture the remains and the artifacts that are left there. But at the same time, we've also allocated a now 1,000 capacity extension to Lost Cemetery. So 1,000 graves, if you think about it, we're anticipating finding a lot. Now what happens, I hear you say, if we get somebody, we know that they're in the Middlesex Regiment, for instance, but we just can't identify them 100% as to who they are. Well, do we just say, well, we didn't know who he was, so that's a shame? Well, no, we don't. He's still buried with full military honours. So that casualty will be taken. He would have a headstone of the Middlesex Regiment. It may say a soldier unknown to God on there, and they would be buried, full military honours, and that's fitting. Their name, which is on a memorial somewhere, would remain. So we still honour the name of the person, but we also do the good military thing of giving them a correct burial. So that's where we are today, and that's the story of discovery. I think it would make a fascinating programme on television, but I don't think we would be allowed. Thank you, sir. Yeah, have a go on that one. I don't think we would be allowed. It's obviously very sensitive because there are still relatives about to this day. Did anybody see the programme on Guy Martin about the Lancaster?
Yeah.
Even on that, they were very careful about how they portrayed it. So really, the important bit about this is we are here to remember, but our work continues, and it will continue for many years to come. And that really is it. Unless anybody's got any questions for me or any of the staff. Questions? Yes?
Do you have your own archaeologists, or do you work with units in France and Belgium?
So we have, from what I understand, we have a bit of both actually. So our we've got a visitor centre, and attached on the back of that is where we produce our headstones, but we've also got some fascinating people. So it's almost like the repair shop. We've got people in there's a guy in there who, when artifacts are found, he cleans them up, tries to identify them, gets them back into good nick, because it might help identify a casualty. And if we can, those go back to the families. We've got others who repair the woodwork on doors in cemeteries. We've got others who do the stonework, obviously. But in amongst that is where we've got that morgue that I talk about, that recovery unit. And they have got a proper table. And when we're there, they did lay out for us a casualty and talk through it and they're trying to work out which bit's which. But we also have dedicated teams in different parts of Europe doing that, and that normally comes back in Bahrain then to be registered. Dennis?
Are they doing the same thing in further afield where there is any development, let's say Mesopotamia for example, or elsewhere?
So anywhere that casualties are found, then the same process happens. The thing is, it's not on the same scale.
No.
And of course all our focus ends up in France and Belgium because of the sheer numbers, you know, and that's why our stone making unit is out there, because there's no point having it back in the UK when we'd only have to pick them up and ship them all out to France anyway. So yeah, it's a good question.
So the headstones go with bodies.
Yes.
So in cemeteries in this country, there are World War I gravestones. Does that mean the soldiers there?
Yes.
Yes.
So how did that go about? Did people have a choice on that, or
No.
how did that work? Are they mainly officers that happened to? Or?
No. So one of the tenets about our organisation was that we would all have exactly the same in death. everybody would be treated equally. So everybody would get a headstone. And I'm going to say the same headstone, but of course there are loads of variations with materials and designs, because the Polish have a different design, Czechoslovaks, you know, so there's lots of different ones. But in theory, everybody would get the same. Now, there are a couple of exceptions where an individual is in a cemetery and actually we know 100% he's there, but we now can't identify where the grave is.
Yes.
So on that occasion, there would be a headstone that says Frank Smith is definitely here somewhere. So you might find somewhere in this cemetery written at the top on cases like that. And again, this is partly because of the sheer scale of and the movement thereafter of doing that job.
But
So
the other reason that they're here is that they died here.
Yes,
so
of
you're
course,
buried.
afterwards, yeah, I get
no,
that.
not after. No, not no. So so it isn't that they've been to the front, they've been injured and come back. It could be they only ever served here. So they could be in
Okay.
training. They could have fallen ill. They could have been, if they're in the Home Guard in the Second World War, they were here. So the key thing is they died here. They weren't brought back from the front. So in January 1915, there was a law passed that said people weren't brought back from the front.
Right.
Yeah. So all the concentrations that Max talked about came about because that basically we're burying where we fall.
Yeah, we've
So
got two. Sorry.
I've got a relation that died in Calais after the war, just after the war. So it was nearly home, but got buried in Calais.
Yes. Correct.
Died of flu. So
When?
would there have been no 1919? So there would have been no choice about him coming back then.
Correct. Because in our terms, the war had not ended in 1919. So by law, the law ended on the 31st of August 1921. So your relative died during the war and was buried where and obviously he got the flu, so he died, but where he fell. So he's buried in Calais.
We've got two in Croft. One in the churchyard, one in the cemetery.
Yes.
One from World War One, one from World War Two. The one in the churchyard went in training down south in Surrey.
Yeah.
Got put into hospital because he got flu.
Yeah.
And then they brought him home and he died in Croft in his mum and dad's bedroom.
Yeah. So quite
And
often,
then the other
so
one.
that's the scenario where
the
they
other
were
one-
ill when they came
Yeah.
home.
The other one
They
was injured,
Yeah.
wounded abroad, brought
Yeah.
back, and
Yeah.
then died in hospital in Ipswich or something.
Yeah.
So
I think the point we're making here is, and this is really important, you know, there are an awful lot of casualties who are in the UK. We always think of those big cemeteries in France and Belgium, but in my eyes, and of course because I work in this country, I think ours are slightly more interesting because they've all got varying reasons why they were buried where they were. Some of it's familial, they wanted to be in a family plot. Some of it is circumstance because they died in training at a place and the family said, no, that's okay, bury him there. But it was always because, you know, we treat everybody the same, whether they're suicide, run over in a blackout, crashed a plane, any number of reasons, not necessarily a battle casualty. They're still serving personnel. And I think that's the important thing, treated the same wherever. So it's a much more interesting social story back here in the UK.
Could I ask, with still recovering these bodies, these young men and women, and with DNA the way it is now, when you discover somebody, do you store the DNA in case later on a family member might?
So there's a good question. So the question is, do we store the DNA for those that are done? And I'm not sure. Any ideas, Chris? So the question was, when casualties are recovered and we perhaps do a DNA, is that maintained and kept?
Yeah, the answer to that is yes.
I thought it
Yes.
was.
Where do you search for DNA matches?
So that I don't know. So in fact,
I would imagine our forensic pathologist knows where to search because that's what we've got.
I didn't know whether you go Ancestry, Find My Past.
Oh,
or...
no.
So anything you want to find out about casualties, anything at all,
Yeah.
you must go to the commission. Go to the commission's
it will be
website,
online.
put your question in, say, listen, my great uncle was killed, you know, I wondered if there's anything, I'd be happy to have DNA or whatever, and I think he might have been here. It will get filtered into the right location and you will get an answer of some kind or another. But it's always go through the Commonwealth War Graves Commission because that's our responsibility, we do look after that.
I think it's quite important that we we specify that it's only about the casualties. We can't give you any information about battles or anything like that.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because, you know, for those of you who go over to France or Belgium, you might go with one of the companies like Leicester or something like that, and they're great. They tell you the story of the battlefield. Our responsibility is about the casualties. Now, the fact that they were in these battles is, you know, we can work alongside them, but the important thing is we are not battlefield historians. So
The other thing we're not responsible for, let's do it the other way around. Quite often, if you go, imagine if you wander around, if you go to Welford Road, where we're going to go with some of our volunteers shortly, you will see a headstone that reads, "Died in France." We're not responsible for that headstone. We're responsible for where he's actually buried in France. Okay, and the interesting thing to do is to take notice of those details and go and look on our website. You can actually find out where the casualty is actually buried, and that's where we're responsible for him or her. We can't make the assumption on the gender. Hello, Mr. Voice.
Mac, you know the new memorials, such as the Normandy one?
yes.
Is that, there's obviously an MOD part to that, but is that ostensibly the CWGC,
No, it's not
and
even
then
the
you end up
MOD.
looking after it?
It's not even the MOD.
It's not?
No, it's a trust. It's a trust.
So that's
Does
probably
the asset transfer to you guys to look after them?
well.
Is that one
They're
of those
in line
small
to-
I
there
think,
is a
I think a
tail.
lot of these things people hope it will be in the future, but now, no.
Right. it's
So
still a
what
trust
I
then.
would look at these big memorials that are going up now in the same way as you would look at the memorials that are inside the at-risk register.
Yeah.
They're done by well-meaning people who want to remember somebody, and whether it be a large group or more focused, it's not our responsibility at the moment.
Yeah, I was mindful because that one's got names on it.
Yes, and a lady was showing me a research tool for that as well, which is great actually, because it means that for us, you got another way of cross-checking names and details.
We do actually have staff on that site, but they're funded by the trust.
Right.
Okay, so they are looked after by the experts, people who know how to look after these memorials, but the trust is paying for it.
I'm very conscious of time. I know that our volunteers are all heading off up to the cemetery to have another tour up there. So if you've got other questions, I'll stay here for a little bit afterwards, and I'm quite happy to talk through them. But ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. And if you haven't had a chance yet, do make sure that you go in and have a look at those memorials, because there's some great stories that go with them. Yeah, enjoy your day, and I might see some of you later.
Thank you very much, Matt. Very grateful.
Thank you.
so much. And if anyone who doesn't get our occasional newsletter, last post, who would like it, please make certain you put your email address on a piece of paper in there. They come out about 3 times a year, but there's no obligation to receive it.
I've got the shrapnel back, thank you.
Volunteers, CWGC volunteers, can we go and meet just over there and we'll have a quick chat about what happens next? Follow me.